and promote social change. Along with indivisible chapters across the country, we lobby our elected officials on key legislation, we attend rallies and take action to promote our causes, and we organize events around our group's key issue areas of democracy, the environment, health, and justice. We're now going to turn for a moment back to our co-sponsor slide so everyone can see that. We are so grateful for our many co-sponsor organizations. The co-sponsors for tonight are all listed on the slide. They're too numerous to mention individually, but they include indivisible chapters across New York State, local indivisible chapters, and several local political and advocacy organizations. Thank you all. Together with some other organizations that help spread the word about tonight's meeting, you have been invaluable partners. And now a quick word about tonight's format. In the first segment, Simon will be providing his assessment of the current 2024 general election landscape, and will talk to us about what we can achieve in November through our collective action. After his remarks, we have a question and answer session. Please feel free to add your questions to the chat as the program progresses, and we will get to as many questions as we can within our time limits tonight. We're also going to be sharing with you some ideas for how to get involved in the campaign. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Stephen Reel, our event organizer and a member of the steering committee.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining Northwest Bronx Indivisible and all of our co-sponsors at this very special event that we are calling the must-win election, all hands on deck. I'm sure I don't need to remind anyone here what's at stake in this year's election. Trump and his MAGA enablers have made no secret of their plans, and yet it often looks like the GOP is ahead. It is in this context that I want to read to you a very brief quote from a piece by David Rothkopf and Bernard Schwartz that appeared in the New Republic earlier this year. After delineating in great detail the horrors that Trump has brought and will continue to bring to our nation, the authors suggest, so ask yourself, is that enough to make you do more than you have done? Is that enough to commit for the next 6 months to do more than you have ever done during an election year, to give more, to canvass more, to spread the word more, to help get voters to the polls, to ensure every member of your family, your friends, your coworkers do the same? The stakes are too high to do less than everything you can. The stakes are too high to allow this man to continue to play any role in American public life. Like me, I'll bet that most of you are ready to say, yes, of course, I will do everything I can. But to be honest and to be candid, reading the news can get me pretty demoralized sometimes, and that can take the wind right out of my sails. It often feels like no matter how hard we fight, we can't get rid of this guy. There have been days when I feel just completely stuck. But thankfully, I have found an antidote to all this funk in the person of tonight's special featured guest, Simon Rosenberg. Simon is a clear-eyed political analyst with over 30 years of experience. He is the author of the insightful Hopium Chronicles on Substack. That's hopium with an H as in hope, not the illegal substance. Simon brings a data-focused and skeptical eye to our current political landscape. He drew national attention in the 22 midterms when most of the mainstream media was forecasting a red wave election. Early on in that cycle, Simon argued that the evidence instead pointed to a close and competitive race. When the votes were counted, the result was extremely close to what Simon had forecast. Simon has advised elected officials and campaigns at all levels of government. He was a regular guest on Fox News for over 17 years, and in recent months has been frequently seen on TV, including appearances on MSNBC and CNN. Simon has served in senior roles at the DNC and the DCCC and worked on 2 presidential campaigns, including a leadership role in the Clinton War Room back in 1992. In 1996, Simon started NDN, a highly influential political organization and think tank, which he ran until March of last year. And so in this election, with the stakes so high, I lean on Simon's Hopium Chronicles nearly every day to give me the optimism I need to continue working to re-elect Joe Biden, hold our majority in the Senate, and flip the House. I am quite sure that you will all feel the same sense of energetic empowerment after hearing what he has to tell us tonight. So it is with great gratitude that I have the honor to welcome tonight's special guest, Simon Rosenberg.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks, Stephen. And thanks to the whole team that's put this together. It's a pretty impressive group. And so thank you all. And as Stephen had mentioned, I think, my mother was born in the Bronx, and we lived as a family when I was young in Washington Heights. And my dad grew up in the Village. And so this is like home base for me a little bit. So thank you all so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm going to speak for 15, 20 minutes about what I think is going on in national politics. Then we'll have time for questions. And I also just want to say thank you all, right, for being here tonight. I mean, this is the leave it all on the playing field election, and I'm just grateful that you're all taking some time to do some work for your country and your democracy. And I know that Stephen and the team is going to be talking about what they want to get done after this too. So make sure you stay around for that in terms of the campaign work that's in front of us. In New York, you don't often have big races. This time we have a whole bunch of House races that we need to go win. And so it's important, some of the work you're going to do in the coming months. So here's my basic take on things. Joe Biden is a good president. The country is better off. We have a very strong case for his reelection. The Democratic Party is strong. We're winning elections all across the country. We're raising tons of money, and we're building the most powerful democratic political machine that any of us have ever seen. And what do they have, the other guys? They have Trump, who is the ugliest political thing we've all ever seen in our lifetime. And their political party looks increasingly more like a raging dumpster fire than a well-oiled machine. So let me go through those in order. And this is my assessment of the landscape. So number one, on us and Joe Biden. If you think about where we were in 2021, sorry, I'll get a little closer to the mic. In 2021, when Joe Biden took office, he probably had one of the worst day ones of any president in American history. Donald Trump had just mismanaged the COVID pandemic, and hundreds of thousands of people had died unnecessarily, and there had been chaos during all of that. The economy was in bad shape. The global economy was teetering. The vaccines had not been distributed yet, right? We were still pre-vaccine distribution. And we had also just had an attack on the Capitol, and our democracy was under threat. The first time in American history there had not been a peaceful transfer of power. There had not been a normal transition that happens between two administrations. And the city of Washington, where I live, was under National Guard occupation for 50 days. And so Joe Biden came in with this fundamental promise that he would get us to the other side of COVID and restore some degree of normalcy in a time of extraordinary chaos when he came in. And I think he's met his fundamental promise to us. I mean, if you look at the data today, we have the strongest economic recovery of any advanced economy in the world. The inflation is lower here than any other advanced economy in the world. We have the best job market since the 1960s, the lowest uninsured rate ever recorded in American history. The deficit is trillions of dollars less. Crime rates are down. The flow to the border is down. Gas prices right now are down. Food prices went down last month and have only risen by 1%, groceries over the last year. I think that he's left the country far better than he's found it. And that also, if you include the fact that we're now producing more oil, gas, and renewables than we've ever done in American history. We're more energy independent than we've ever been, or at least in recent decades. And also the big three bills that Joe Biden passed not only are accelerating the energy transition and reasserting America's global leadership in the critical fight against climate change, but they will create jobs and opportunities for workers in America for a generation to come. He's been a good president. The country is better off. He's been successful, I think, at the core undertaking. And I think the success of his presidency is actually doing something very important in the election, which is that it's causing the central Republican attacks against him to evaporate. The economy is strong. It isn't weak. Inflation is down. It's not up. Crime rates are plummeting across the country. They're not raging. There is no war on energy that's causing gas prices to go up. We've had higher production than ever before. We produced more oil last year than any year in American history and in any country in the history of the world, by the way. The issue of the border, which is we've been talking about this week, flow to the border this year has come way down because of Joe Biden's policies. And we proposed a bipartisan solution to tackle the border crisis. It's the Republicans who want the chaos on the border. We're now the party that wants order at the border. They're the party that wants and seeks chaos. And we know from the Tom Suozzi's race that many of you may have been involved in, that was a central part of the fight in the Suozzi race, right? Where Suozzi said, look, I want to pass a bipartisan bill. My opponent wants to keep the border chaotic. And it was effective, and we worked, and it worked. We did better than we anticipated in that race, where immigration was central to that debate. And then I think on the two major attacks against Biden, the Republicans use, that he was have also started evaporating to some degree. The first is the Biden crime family story, right? The corruption. You notice that's completely disappeared now. And because the Republicans were exposed to having laundered Russian disinformation into our political system again, and all these charges were false and fake, and were mainly, the core charges were generated by somebody who had a relationship with Russian intelligence. And then secondly, his age, right? This is going to be an issue in the election. We know it. But I think the way we have to talk about it is that Joe Biden has been successful as a president because of his age, experience, and wisdom, and not in spite of it. That crazy day one that I described earlier, maybe it was a blessing for the country to have the most experienced person to ever enter the Oval Office come in a time of enormous challenge for the country. And so I think we have to view his age as both something that has an asset and a liability, not just a liability. We have to run into it, right? I don't think we should shy away from it. And I think he did a lot to assuage people's concerns about his age during his excellent State of the Union. And also in Washington, I think a lot of people here found that his White House Correspondents' speech that he gave a few weeks ago, which wasn't seen by a lot of people, but it was seen by the leaders of this city, he also did an exemplary job. And so I think some of the concerns about his performance and frankly, his willingness to do these two debates with Trump shows he's got confidence, he's ready to go, right? So I think many of the central attacks against Biden have evaporated, which is beginning to change this election from being a referendum on Biden to a referendum on Trump, which is an election we'll win, in my view, if that happens. Second is us, right? We've been kicking ass as Democrats, right? We won in 2018 and 2020, took the House and the Senate away from them. We took the presidency away from them. But what happened after 2020, I think, is even more remarkable. Starting in the spring of 2022, we've just continued to outperform expectations, and they've continued to underperform. I think something broke inside the Republican Party with Dobbs in the spring of 2022, and they've had extraordinary performance issues again and again and again. And I think for us, it fired up our base, our activists, because we recognize the clear threat that the Republican Party had become. And so in 2022, when a red wave was supposed to be coming, we actually gained a U.S. Senate seat. We gained 4 state legislative chambers. We gained 2 governorships. We did lose ground in New York and California, right? But we're going to go get all that back this time, right? Aren't we? In 2024 together. And my organization just endorsed in 11 House races. 3 of them are in New York, 1 in New Jersey. We've already raised over $120,000 just in 2 days for these races. And we're going to go get those back. We had some disappointments. Not everything went perfectly, but we did far better than anybody expected. And then in 2023, we had a blue wave year. We won elections all across the country, from Wisconsin to Ohio to Virginia to Colorado to Florida, right? It was an extraordinary year for us. We, again, outperformed expectations. They underperformed. And that basic dynamic of us outperforming expectations and them struggling has shown up in 2024. Trump has underperformed his public polling in all these early states in the Republican primary. And we've been winning elections like New York 3 that we were told was this big bellwether for the 2024 election. I talked to Tom Suozzi on election day. He said he thought he's going to win by 1 or 2 points. We won by 8 points, right? Incredible performance. And part of my theory about what's happening is that this extra little boost we get, our overperformance, is coming from all of you. And it's the work that you do, the money that you raise. It's giving our campaigns the most money they've ever had. It's allowing us to control the information environment in these elections, and it's also allowing us to push our performance to the upper end of what's possible in election after election. And so I'm very proud of all of you. I think all of you have been central to our success and to our continued overperformance. And so, and then the other thing that's happened just recently, right? We have this new data. We are dramatically outraising the Republicans this year. We have a 3-4 cash in hand, a 3 to 4 to 1 cash in hand advantage in the presidential race. Many of our House and Senate races have enormous cash in hand advantages. We are way ahead of them organizationally and financially, and they're not going to be able to catch up. It's too late now. And so we're not only winning elections, right? I mean, the way I describe it now is we have a better candidate, we have better arguments, and we have better campaign apparatus. And it's one of the reasons I'm so optimistic about what we're going to be able to do. And then finally, them. Let's talk about them. Donald Trump. All of you know Donald Trump. You're all New Yorkers, right? I think the way I view him now is that he is a far weaker candidate than he was in 2020. His performance on the stump is far more degraded and erratic. He's making extraordinary mistakes. The campaign's having to walk back almost every day. He's really an embarrassment on the stump and is a liability for the campaign. He isn't who he used to be, right? Number two is that the campaign apparatus that they have, the machine underneath, is an extraordinary dumpster fire right now. The RNC just ousted their entire senior team. They haven't really put in a whole new team. They haven't really built a general election operation. You've had dozens of prominent Republican officials indicted for trying to overturn the election in key battleground states. They're struggling to raise money. There's an unprecedented rebellion against Donald Trump coming from Republican leaders like Dick Cheney and Mike Pence, and it's 2 former vice presidents, former party nominee, former vice presidential nominee, former Speaker of the House, dozens of Trump administration officials. The opposition to Trump internally is unprecedented in the modern era of American politics. And then finally, they're having bad candidate problems again, right? These kind of bad candidates like Kari Lake in Arizona and Mark Robinson in North Carolina, who are such an embarrassment. These kinds of folks all lost in 2022 because they were just the non-MAGA part of the Republican Party just couldn't follow them. They were just too extreme. And we won in places we didn't think we were going to win. And even when we won, we got to 59% in Colorado, 57% in Pennsylvania, 55% in Michigan. Our margins in 2022 in the battleground states were remarkable. And so they have a lot of bad candidate problems who are going to be hurting their brand in these key battleground states like Wisconsin and Michigan and Arizona and in North Carolina, where I think Mark Robinson and Kari Lake and their awfulness is going to give us extraordinary opportunities to do what we need to go do in Wisconsin in Arizona and in North Carolina. And then finally about Trump, I want to go through this because this is really important, because I think one of the things that we have to do in our communications with our networks and our families and our communities is we need to be plain spoken and blunt about the threat that Trump represents today, right? He's far more dangerous and extreme as a candidate than he was even in 2020. His agenda has gotten far more menacing towards us, towards our freedoms, towards our democracy, towards our way of life, towards our economy, towards immigrants, right? In virtually every way, he's become a far more menacing and dangerous figure than he used to be. And it's important that we learn how to articulate that to people. But the other thing that I think is going to happen is that there are 6 things that people are going to come to find out about Trump that they didn't know about him in 2020 that I think is going to matter. Number one, and these are things that he's going to have to overcome, because these are things that we're going to share, the family is going to share with the broader community. Number one is that he raped E. Jean Carroll in a department store dressing room in Manhattan, by the way. Number two is that he oversaw one of the largest financial frauds in American history and has been fined hundreds of millions of dollars. And he and his 2 sons have been banned from doing certain types of business in New York State over this. 3 is that he stole America's secrets. He lied to the FBI about it. He shared those secrets with other people. It is without question the greatest betrayal of the country by a former president in all of our history. 4th is that he tried to end American democracy for all time in 2021. He led an armed attack on the Capitol in 2021. And he has now promised that he's going to finish the job if he gets ending American democracy for all time, if he gets into the White House in January 2025. Fifth, he and his family have corruptly taken more money from foreign governments than any political family in our history. And then sixth, and importantly, he's singularly responsible for ending Roe and stripping the rights and freedoms away of more than half the population of the United States. He is also, in his idiocy and his diminishment, his decision to come out for states' rights on abortion really meant that what he thought he was being clever, right? He thought he was doing something that was putting him in a middle ground position. But what he was really doing was embracing the most extreme abortion bills in the country. And so he's for Idaho, and Idaho ban all, total ban, jail time for doctors. They have an anti-trafficking statute where if you bring a minor across the border, you can be indicted and jailed. It's a crime in Idaho. And if you're for that, and if something like Idaho is okay anywhere, then he will be okay with it everywhere. And he ended up becoming the most extreme abortion, the most dangerous abortion extremist in the country. And I think he didn't think he was doing that, right? Like, I think in his diminishment, in his idiocy, as I call it, he thought he was finding a middle ground position. And instead, he had cemented himself on a position that really matters to voters of being around 15, 20, 25% in current polling. So when you push all that together, right, I'm very optimistic about what's about to happen over the next 5.5 months. And I want to say one last thing before we turn it over to questions, Stephen, is that on polling, and I have been in a battle on this week, pretty significantly about the nature of polling and where we are. And for those of you who know, I did get 2022 right. Donald Trump is not winning this election. He's not ahead in this election. He's not favored in this election. We have a close competitive election where neither side is ahead and neither side is frankly where they want to be at this point. But I want you to understand psychologically that Donald Trump is not winning or ahead. This is very important for all of us. And let me explain why, right? So first of all, just on the national polling, there have been dozens of polls in the last 6 weeks showing Biden ahead. And there are, as of last Friday, and I just haven't looked this week, there were more polls showing Biden ahead than showing Trump ahead. And so, the fair way to look at the data is that we've probably gained a couple points in the last few months. We've gained it in the congressional generic. Biden, I think, has gained a point or two. We may be ahead slightly. We may be behind slightly. It's just very close right now. But we're not trailing, right? There's no definitive, in a poll, if you're down by a point because of margin error, you're not losing. It's just close and competitive. The election's close and it's competitive. Number two is that in the states, there have now been in the last few months or last 6 weeks, 6 battleground state polls done. Of the 7, some of them have 6, some of them have 7 states. And in all of them, except one, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin are within margin of error. I mean, they're tied. And if Trump has to win Arizona to win, Trump has to win Arizona, North Carolina, Georgia, Nevada, and he has to win one of those blue wall states. Well, if he's not ahead outside of margin of error in a poll in one of those states, then he's not actually winning one of those states. And therefore he's not winning the election or ahead in the election. And we now have 6 polls. And in the New York Times poll, the terrible New York Times poll 2 weeks ago, among likely voters, all 3 were within margin of error. Among registered voters, I think it was only Michigan was outside of margin of error, right? So there have been 18 polls done of those blue wall states in the last 6 weeks. 17 of them have it within margin of error, which means that Trump is not ahead. He has to be ahead definitively outside of margin of error in one of those states to get to 270. He's not at 270. Either are we, by the way, right? We're not at 270 either. And so it just means that what the polling tells us, and the way that when I looked at the polling and all the data in 2022, what I said was that it was a close competitive election and not a red wave. The idea that Trump is leading is sort of red wavy to me. It's a false Republican-led narrative that's being aped and parroted by the media that isn't actually being supported by the data. Now, you may feel like, well, why is it so close, Simon? Trump is so terrible, right? Biden's been a good president.
Right.
That's what a campaign's for, right? The campaign is just beginning. All of you know that. And I think that as we prosecute this campaign, where we have better arguments, much more money, we're going to have a more powerful team on the ground that's going to push turnout to the upper end of possible. We got all of you, right? All over the country, millions of proud patriots who love their country are going to come fight like hell for Joe Biden, right? I'm confident that when we go prosecute all these arguments that I've made today, that we're going to win the election. Doesn't mean it's guaranteed, right? I mean, to use a basketball analogy, we're like a higher seed in a tournament. We should win, but we have to go win the game. We got to go play the game and win it, right? And I think where things are now, using a basketball analogy, is that, the game's tied after the first quarter, and 3/4 of the election of the game is still ahead of us. Finally, I want to remind everybody one important thing. The voting in 2024 begins on September 20th. The election starts in 4 months. It's not 5.5 months away, right? It starts in 4 months. It's soon. It's coming. We all take time off in the summer, right? So let's say, so the election's really starting in 3 work months, right? If we take August out of it, it's really soon. We got to get to work. And I'm confident if we do the work together, we're going to have the election we all want to have, and we're going to go kick their ass and win this thing in November. So Stephen and everybody, thank you so much. That's my assessment of things. Let's get to questions.
Thank you very much for that assessment. We have quite a few questions that have been listed in the chat.
I would expect nothing less from New Yorkers.
Exactly. First one is, I'm sorry, Kathy, do you have something to say, or do we jump into questions?
No, let's jump right into questions.
Okay. So how important is money in this election? I know you mentioned that we're ahead there. Okay. The woman who won Maryland was heavily outspent, as an example.
Yeah. Money matters a lot. Yeah, of course, there are examples where candidates who have less win. It's not, but you'd rather have much more money than less money, right? Like you'd rather, and what money buys you is that it buys you the ability to talk to voters, and it also buys you turnout capacity, right? There are more Democrats in America than Republicans, but we have more episodic voters than they do. We have more new and episodic voters, and so turning out our base and our coalition costs money. And the good news is that because of the early vote now, and the way that we've adapted our politics to the early vote in many places, and now I guess in New York, right, you have early voting now, or mail voting, or whatever, the laws have changed there, right? Finally, we are now able to get to our GOTV targets, our secondary and tertiary GOTV targets, a week before election day. It used to be you'd start calling those people at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, right? Now we can reach them earlier. And so the early vote has been a huge benefit for us as a family, because it's allowing us to get to GOTV targets and people who were, on the fence of voting much earlier and more powerfully, because of early vote, and also because of all the money that we have. And we were able to have much bigger campaigns. We have many more volunteers. Many of you have made calls. In the Swazi race, right? We made 2 million phone calls in the Swazi race in 5 weeks. I mean, that's like the kind of number of calls you'd make in Michigan in the general election. And Swazi has done like the tour thanking the Democratic grassroots for, we sent handwritten postcards, 5 handwritten postcards to every Democratic household in that race. Those kinds of things were not possible before, and it's making a huge difference. And so, and that Trump's going to have, at some point, Trump's going to have a lot of soft money. We have a lot of hard money. And the difference, let me make sure you all understand the difference, is that when you're in a federal election, so presidency, House, and Senate, you are by law given what's called lowest unit rate when you buy a TV ad. So let's say when you buy an ad, it costs $1. When a super PAC comes in, they don't have lowest unit rate, and they have to bid for the available. It's like an auction, right? They have to buy ads, and it gets auctioned up. It's often the case that a super PAC has to pay $3, $4, $5 for every $1 that the hard dollars spend. And so Trump can't make up the money that he's not raising with billionaire money. You can't do that, because he would have to outraise us by 4 or 5 to 1 to make up for the hard dollar deficiency that he has. And they're just not going to do that. We're also raising a lot of soft money too, right? So this is a very meaningful thing, because what it does is it builds us better organizations. And the team that's running the Biden campaign know how to build presidential field operations. And so I think this is when you look at the balance sheet, right, like our assets and liabilities, our financial and organizational advantages could be the difference between us winning and losing the election, in my view. It's significant and it's meaningful, and you should be proud that we're doing something like this that makes people at the center of our politics and not billionaires and oligarchs.
Simon, a lot of people in the chat are asking questions about how do we get young people who neither seem engaged nor enthusiastic to vote for Biden?
Yeah, I mean, the most couple things about that is that we know from the polling that the Institute of Politics at Harvard has done. They do the kind of gold standard quarterly poll of 18 to 29-year-olds now, going back for more than 20 years. Their last poll, the vote intent of 18 to 29-year-olds was exactly in the same place as where it was 4 years ago, meaning that we could see historic youth turnout in this election. Doesn't mean we will, right? But it's could. The second thing is the current 18 to 29-year-olds have, by various measures of political engagement, are more politically engaged than any group of 18 to 29-year-olds in the last 50 years. So we could see a very significant youth turnout. And one of the most interesting things about the protests, and we just don't know, is does the protests actually create much bigger turnout? Because it's harder to have avoided politics. It's woken people up to the fact that they've got peers who are taking political action of whatever kind they are, and they need to pay a little bit more attention to the election because of that. It's very possible the protests may end up having a beneficial effect, for youth turnout. And we're going to win young voters by somewhere between 15 and 25 points, right? We don't know the number. I mean, the Harvard IOP poll had it 19 points. The Pew poll had it 21 points. And so when you're winning a constituency by 15 to 20 points, bigger turnout means you just get more votes, right? Like it's kind of a basic math thing. And so, I'm not as down on what's happening with young people as many people are. And also, just to give you two other data points, right? In the Harvard IOP poll, they gave people 16 options to say, what's the most important issue for you? And Israel Gaza was 15th out of 16. In the recent Axios poll of college students that was done, Axios gave people 10 options of what's most important, and Israel Gaza was 10 out of 10. For most young people, Israel Gaza is very distant. It's a very intense issue. It's an important issue for lots of people in our family, right? But for the average marginal, 25-year-old who's trying to make a living and get by, that's very distant stuff for them. And it's very different from Vietnam, right? In Vietnam, there were 18-year-olds dying every day. This isn't the same. And for most Americans, it's an important issue, but there are just issues that matter much more. And that's also true for 18 to 29-year-olds. So we have to go onto college campuses and fight it out. We have to be aggressive. We can't let loud voices drown out our voices in this coming election. So we have work to do. But I think that if we do the work, put our head down, I think we can have the kind of result that we need to have to win.
Simon, how do you assess the effect of third party or independent candidates on Biden/Trump?
I think it's not knowable yet, and it's actually all over the place in the polling. I mean, you can see some polls have Kennedy at 3, others have him at 12. It's how you ask the question. I think that there are polls showing Kennedy taking more from Trump than from Biden. I describe Kennedy sometimes as like Frankenstein's monster, right? Like the Trump people, the MAGA people created Kennedy, and now in some polls he's actually coming back and pulling more from Trump than from Biden. It's like the monster's coming back to eat, to kill Dr. Frankenstein. And the good news is that Kennedy and Cornel West and Jill Stein are not serious candidates, right? I mean, there could have been a very serious third-party candidate that could have really upset the election. Robert Kennedy is not a serious candidate. And I think our capacity to communicate that to potential Kennedy voters or people who are interested in him is something that we can do because he's given us so much ammunition to do so. And I don't know if you saw the New York Times, I wrote about it in Hopium today. I mean, the New York Times had a story today about one of his top staffers quit this week. And first of all, everyone who works for him is a Trump person, right? They're all MAGA people. All of his donors are MAGA people. Um, Kennedy was a Trump appointee. He served in the Trump administration in a commission dealing with vaccines, right? His campaign is a product of MAGA. It's a MAGA fraud campaign. And I think our most important opponent is Donald Trump. And we have to make our case, sell ourselves, and we have to degrade Trump. That's job one. And then job two will also be about degrading the other ones. And look, there is a whole team of people, very serious people who are Democrats, and an organization that's been built that's out going after Kennedy every day, and they're making an impact. And so I'm more worried about Trump than I am about the third party folks. We need to define Trump in the next few months and beat him. And then but I think people are minding the store here. They're not ignoring this. We all learned our lesson, right? We all understand. And I just go back to this basic idea that Kennedy is a ridiculous figure. And once you get past the name and the face and the body and everything else, right? And that makes, that leaves me confident that this is a manageable problem as opposed to an unmanageable problem.
Simon, somebody asked if voting restrictions and voter suppression is likely to hurt us in 2024.
It's unlikely in the battleground states because we have Democratic governors in all but two of them, and in the states where we don't have Democratic governors, there is a strong Democratic infrastructure there. I will tell you that some of this voter suppression stuff to me is a little bit of a boogeyman thing. And I think that I talked about this last night on the Hopium chat for anyone who was on it in our presentation. What the Republicans are going to try to do in the next couple of months is to do what every authoritarian leader does, which is to try to convince you that the election's over, that a new red wave is coming, that even if Democrats win the election, somehow they're going to magically steal it from us, and that doing any work or trying to raise money, go work in a campaign, it's just futile, right? No, don't worry about, don't do it, right? We somehow have a secret plan in the back room of MAGA, right? In the Wizard of Oz is going to somehow take away the election from us, even after we've won it, right? It didn't work in 2020 and 2021. It didn't happen in any state in between now and then. It doesn't mean they couldn't do it. But part of it is they want you to be scared. They want you to believe that the work you're about to do is worthless and that there's no chance of us winning. That's what's about to happen. That's why Trump is in the South Bronx. That's why Trump is going to go to San Francisco. This is a psyop, right? This is a way to try to convince you that resistance is futile. And if you listen to people like Ruth Ben Guyot, or Timothy Snyder, what they'll explain to you about the way authoritarians work is that they want you to, what Timothy Snyder calls, obey in advance. They want you to give up and not do any of the work and make it easier for the authoritarian to rule and to win. So just be aware that what you're going to be getting a lot of in the next 6 months, 5.5 months, is versions of red wave. Oh, it's over. Democrats are dead. Trump is at 1,000,000%, right? Like, remember they said that he raised $50 million in that event a few weeks ago? They raised like $20 million, right? And remember, they've been lying about the 2020 election for 3.5 years. They lied about the red wave in 2022, and they're going to lie every day about what's happening in this election. And don't fall for it, right? Like, we all have to be smarter for that. And so, could there be some kind of nefarious thing that happens, where they stack, all the polling places and scare people away from voting? Fine, then vote early, vote by mail, right? This is why the early vote is so important. And it's why we need to vote on day one. All of you should be building a campaign wherever you are to convince every prime Democrat to vote on day one. If we vote on day one together, what happens is that the campaign can then move on to the second tier and third tier GOTV targets. And when we do that, you increase turnout. So by voting early on day one, you actually increase overall Democratic turnout. It also makes it much harder for them to cheat, right? Because people see people voting for 2 weeks. They get daily reports about how many people have voted. And that's why Trump hates this early voting and mail voting so much, that it makes it much harder for him to cheat. and to do something nefarious. So the antidote is winning the election by as much as we can and pushing our vote, our collective vote early as much as we can wherever we are, and voting, creating campaigns around voting on day one. When we vote on day one, we create more Democrats. It's more likely we win.
Simon, do you think that Biden's failure to be consistent on climate change, example, as in higher oil production, hurts Biden with his constituency and especially the young?
Biden's been the most consequential climate leader in world history. And with nobody remotely close to him. The IRA that he passed in 2022 was the single largest government investment in accelerating the climate transition, the energy transition, and countering climate change that there's ever been. We have a very strong case to make. I mean, when statues are made of Joe Biden in 25 years from now, I think they're going to be about his climate leadership. And the idea that we can just, given the way that oil is being used as a weapon of war by the powers in the Middle East and by Russia, the notion, in my view, that we would just stop doing domestic gas and oil production is national suicide. It would be national suicide if we did that. We would be giving hostile foreign powers complete control over our country, our economy, and everything. And we have to be both aspirational and pragmatic at the same time. I mean, ending oil production here would be turning the keys of the country over to Vladimir Putin and Saudi Arabia, and we can't do that. And so I think we're doing what we need to do right now to have greater control over our own destiny. And we've made very wise choices. And I'm very proud of the president. I wish actually he would talk about this more. I think that he actually doesn't toot his own horn enough about this and his leadership on climate. So I think we have a very powerful case to make. Is he perfect? Are any of us perfect? Right? Do we all get hundreds on our tests every day? No way, right? But in terms of this, let's just be very clear. Joe Biden is the most consequential leader in climate in human history, and we should be selling it that way to all of our networks and our peers, in my view.
Simon, for voters who don't pay, attention to everything that happens in politics and policy, Republicans often have a single overarching narrative for their elections campaigns, such as Morning in America or Make America Great. Is there an overarching narrative or theme for the Biden campaign?
It's a great question, and I think my honest answer is not right now, right? I mean, I think that they would say, and if you go back to Joe Biden's State of the Union, if you go back to the videos they produced when the campaign began in March of 2023, that the core of the campaign is around fighting for democracy and freedom. And I think it's why Joe Biden ran for president, right? I mean, he said that he ran because of Charlottesville, and it would motivated him. If you haven't read his Morehouse College speech that he gave on Sunday, please read it. I learned a lot in that speech. I mean, it was a very personal speech. Biden clearly wrote it himself. And one of the things he talked about, which I knew conceptually, but it sort of came to me in a more powerful way, is that Wilmington, Delaware in 1968 had longer National Guard occupation than any other city in the country after the riots that took place in 68, after Martin Luther King was shot. And he was, what happened after that was that Biden left his law firm that he was at and became a public defender. And his whole life changed, and he became a champion of civil rights. He left as he argued, parts of Maryland and Delaware were actually with the South in the Civil War. And as he said in the speech, the Democratic Party in Delaware in that period was an old Southern Democratic Party, a racist, segregationist party. And the reason he became the Senate candidate at 30 years old was there were no civil rights Democrats. He was like one of the only ones, right? And so that's why they cleared the field for him and let him run. And Richard Nixon won Delaware with 60% of the vote in 1972 when Biden ran. And Biden won his race by 3,000 votes. And the reason I raise this is that I didn't really understand how central the civil rights movement was to Joe Biden's identity and to who he was and why he got into politics. I really didn't understand it in the way that this speech, and I'm not, I didn't work for Biden. I'm not a, deep aficionado on Biden, but it's a very powerful speech and I would recommend it to everybody. And so I do think that the campaign today, its overarching narrative is that, that the country, our freedoms and our democracy are under unprecedented attack, and that we're running this campaign in order to preserve both. Is that sufficient? Is that where we will be in a few months? I don't know. But I do think it's a good question and something I've been thinking about a lot, because the Republicans the other day released an ad that attacked Biden by saying failure, no, weak, failure, dishonest, right? And I think that we have to respond. And if you read Hopium every day, you're starting to see me use words like strong much more. We have to come back saying strong, successful, integrity, right? Like there has to be a positioning of him against the way they're going after him, which is as a weak leader, right? And we have to make him a strong leader, a powerful leader, a global leader of climate change, right? We have to put more emphasis and energy around strength in this election, because it's where Trump is going. But I think it's a good question. And my honest answer is I think we're in an in-between place on that right now, and we need to get to a better place on that. And there's time for that. And I think part of what's happened is the Biden campaign has spent the last 2 months staffing up, building state operations and everything else. Now, I think now the campaign's really going to begin. I think the debates were brilliant. It was a huge win for us, in my view, the way it was handled. I think the campaign is starting to really go into like full general election mode. And my guess is that soon we're going to have greater clarity on that. And if we don't, we should ask for it. You should continue. Great question. You should continue to agitate for it, because we need it.
Simon, Trump's latest trial is about to come to an end. How do you look at the outcome, either guilty or innocent, and will it have any effect at all on the election?
Yeah, I mean, those 6 things I went over earlier are, I think we made a mistake in waiting for Mueller. And what we did with Mueller is, rather than prosecuting the facts of what happened, that the Russian government penetrated one of our political campaigns and one of our political parties and had a huge impact on the 2016 election. I think a determinative impact, personally, in the election in 2016. Rather than us holding hearings on this and debating this, we waited for Mueller. We outsourced it because Democrats like lawyers and we respect lawyers, right? And Republicans treat lawyers like they're employees, right? We have respect for lawyers, and so we respected this guy, Robert Mueller. And it was a huge strategic error by us, because what it meant was we weren't spending 2 years reminding the country that Donald Trump owed his presidency to Vladimir Putin, and that there had been a penetration of one of our 2 political parties. We never really made that case. And then he didn't either, by the way. Mueller didn't either. And so I don't want to wait for Jack Smith. I don't want to wait for any of the other prosecutors. We have these 6 things that I went over that are enough, I think, for us to win the election. And they're all facts on the ground. I was on Lawrence O'Donnell last week, and Larry Andrew Weissman was on before me, and who's on every night, by the way, it seems. And he was asked by Lawrence about this, and he said, legally, what can Biden talk about? And he said he can talk about the facts of the case, things that have happened. And I seized on that, because that's what I've been arguing. I was happy that such a prominent lawyer agreed with me. I don't know anything about the law. I'm not a lawyer. But the point I'm making is those 6 things I went over earlier are all fair game for us to be talking about now, and don't require a conviction. They don't require an indictment. They don't require anything. They're things that have happened, right? If there is a conviction between now and election, I think it's gravy. But we shouldn't wait for Jack Smith. We shouldn't wait for convictions. We have to go prosecute the campaign now. We have to learn from what I think was a huge error a few years ago in how we prosecuted the Russia case. And so I think we have enough. If he's convicted, I think it will matter in the election. I think it will make it harder for him to win.
Simon, there's an interesting question that what you've talked about is so logical and makes so much sense, but a lot of voters don't really seem to use a lot of logic. How can the case be made for Biden on an emotional basis?
I mean, I think, it's a great question. And I think that part of the reason I do what I do, and I'm a former journalist, I worked for ABC News as a young guy, and I grew up in the media business. I think that part of what is happening in the country right now, because of our degraded information environment, because of social media, because of the weakening of the press, the independent press, and the business models around the press, because of foreign disinformation, because of Trumpiness, um, this whole idea of objective truth is being weakened, and that there is an objective reality in the world. And I'm quoted in the New Yorker today in a piece saying that we have to be able to distinguish between what people believe and what is true, right? And that this idea that just because somebody believes it doesn't make it true, and we have to, I think, fight with such. This is like core enlightenment stuff, right? Like we have to fight with everything we got to say that there is an objective reality, that the sky is blue, that the economic data. I mean, I got into it with a woman on Twitter today who, just so you know, grocery prices went down last month. They went down. Like people have been talking about groceries, food going down. They went down last month. And somebody on Twitter said, that's BS. Where I am, things have gone up. And I said, they may have gone up where you are, but we have data on this. And across the country, they went down. And I don't care if they went up where you are. I'm telling you that they went down. And you can't fight with me on this, right? This is an objective truth that prices went down. And I got into it on purpose because I think we have to distinguish in our heads. We have to stay with everything we got, with all the power that we have. We cannot let go of this idea that there is an objective reality out there and that there is data and truth. The sky is blue, it isn't red. I don't care what Donald Trump says. Because they want us to lose that connection. They want us to believe that everything is negotiable, but it isn't, right? There is actually data and objective truth in the world. And I think that, so I spend a lot of my time trying to connect people to things that are true, and to data, and to charts and graphs, and to analytical stuff, and as a campaign to keep us truthful and grounded. So when you think about like what is going on in the economy, you actually can have an understanding of what is true, even if you don't feel it, right? Or your friends don't feel it. There is data telling us what is true. And that's really what I spend a lot of my time on. I'm not spending my time conveying the emotional ads and the kind of things that happen in a campaign. Think of hopium like the raw material that feeds into the final. I'm a wholesaler, I'm not a retailer, right? In the sense that the campaigns themselves build the media and the narratives and the emotion to sell directly to voters. And I'm not really in that business. I'm really speaking more to all of you, to activists that people care about. But it's a great question. But I do think it's where media comes in and campaigns come in, and that the evocation of emotion and power. If you go back and look at some of those early Biden videos from March of last year, there's a lot of emotion in those videos, right? My guess is, here's a prediction, and I don't predict the future. I don't think anybody can predict the future, but I'll make a prediction, or I'll make a guess, is that I think you're going to see a lot of direct-to-camera videos in ads in the final 2 months, meaning real people speaking directly to camera about something that is really passionate and meaningful to them, that is why they're supporting Joe Biden or why they're against Trump. And these things will be evocative and emotional. And what we know from research is that those kinds of direct-to-camera ads are usually the most effective in moving voters and reaching people that are hard to reach. So my guess is, it's a guess, and you can email me in October and say, Simon, where are all those ads, right? I think we'll see a lot of those kinds of ads, and they will be evocative and emotional. But good question. Great questions tonight, everybody. New Yorkers are smart. I'm not surprised.
Probably one last question, and this may get a little technical in that how do pollsters define likely voters? Like, what is a likely voter and how do they figure that out? And
Okay,
should we trust it?
I'm going to give you. I have a new rap about Tom Bonnier and I are going to write a piece together. We had a long talk yesterday, and we talked today. We have resisted diving into the polling insanity, other than just me looking at polls and explaining what I'm seeing. However, that has to change, and based on things that are going on. So let me just say a few things about polls, just to give you advice in order to make yourself less crazy, right? Because it's all. So number one, the polls are all over the place, right? And so if you're confused, it's okay because it's actually really confusing. So number one, polls can't predict the future. They can only tell you about what's happening today. They can't even tell you what's happening tomorrow. It's a snapshot in time. Two, think of polls like an impressionist painting and not a picture, not a photograph, meaning that it is only a fuzzy representation of reality, not a precise one. Polls are part of what's happening right now is that the people who talk about polls are overselling the accuracy of polling. Polling has built in 3 to 4 points margin of error, which means when they say Biden's at 46, he could be at 42 or he could be at 50, right? So think of polling as like a range. It's not, there isn't, what you hear pollsters talk about is they're like, Biden's at 46, right? Or Trump's at 47 and Trump's leading. The truth is, for those of us who do this and make a living off of this stuff, if you get a poll back that's like 47, 46, all you know is that the election's close. It's not clear who's up. One could be up, the other one could be up, right? So the other thing is that there isn't really an objective truth, like I was saying earlier, about where the race is. It's a range. It's an estimate. It's a series of possibilities, which is why things are all over the place. Fourth, is I think this is the thing I'm really going to start going hard on in the next few weeks, is that we're also, I think, doing a very bad job as analysts in what I call acknowledging the tension in the data, meaning that when you have an ABC poll come out that shows Biden up 5 and a CNN poll showing Trump up 6 in the same week, what would be, let me do it differently. The New York Times, you're New Yorkers, let me use the New York Times. So last week, the New York Times, in 2 different polls, produced 3 sets of data. They produced a registered voter set of data in the states, in the battleground states. They then did likely voter, and the question about likely voter is there isn't a universal way of determining likely voter. I mean, 80% of people who are registered to vote in an election, give or take, right? So there's a little bit of art here, not science. Some of it's self-identified. Do you vote in certain elections? Every pollster has a different way of determining likely voters. So it's still like everything else in polling, it's a little soft and fuzzy, right? And so, and Stephen, I'm going to wrap up here, is that for time reasons, is that the thing that is happening now, and so then the New York Times did a registered voter poll of battleground states, a likely voter poll of battleground states, and then they did this other poll, the different pollster that was a national poll. The registered voter poll, which was the headline, they chose to sort of use the registered voter numbers as the way they framed their understanding of the election, had Trump up in 5 out of their 6 states, and the headline was Trump leads in 5 out of 6 states. In the likely voter poll, Trump only led in 3 of the 6 states. And Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin were all within margin of error. And as I said earlier, Trump has to win one of those. And so in the registered voter poll, you could credibly say that Trump was leading the election based on that data. In the likely voter poll, you could not say that. The election was clearly tied and even. And then in the other poll, the national poll, Biden was ahead by 3. So Biden was leading. So one set of data, Trump's leading. Second set of data, dead even. Third, Biden's leading. The New York Times, instead of acknowledging the tension in the data, that the data wasn't all saying the same thing, chose to resolve that tension by just talking about the registered voters. And that was an editorial decision the New York Times made. And it was a bad decision. To me, it was a misleading decision. What would have been more responsible for Nate Cohn and the New York Times would have been to acknowledge that all the data wasn't pointing in the same direction and that there was tension. The Washington Post did this a year ago. A year ago, the Washington Post did this very extensive poll that had Trump up by 10 points. They wrote about their poll, and then they said, by the way, there's all these other polls that show the race really close. We're acknowledging that our data and this other data are irreconcilable. There's tension. And we just want to let everybody know that we don't really know where the election is. And what should happen much more among commentators and analysts is to acknowledge the tension in the data, that not all the data is pointing in the same direction. And so, for example, like everyone's freaked out about the states. Do you guys know that in the last 2 weeks, there are polls out that show us ahead in Arizona, ahead in Michigan, ahead in Pennsylvania, ahead in Wisconsin, tied in Nevada, and within margin of error, and essentially tied in North Carolina and Georgia? Did you know that? The answer is probably no one on this call knew this, because but those polls all happened, right? And what's happening is that CNN, does a clear, crappy outlier poll, and then they talk about that poll for 3 weeks, and they ignore all the other polls. Instead of saying, by the way, here's our poll, and here's what other polls are saying, which would be the responsible thing to do in journalism, they just stick with their thing. And so what they do is they reconcile the tension by basically picking one, which then somebody has to pick it, right? Like an editorial human has to say, we're going to pick that one to go with. And in a New Yorker interview that was published today of me, the reporter, which was in a crazy interview, and I'm not sure it's worth your time, but he kept using the CNN poll as the baseline of understanding the election. And I said, why are you using this poll? I mean, it's the single most pro-Trump poll taken in the last 3 months. There's like 20 other polls showing the race Biden ahead. Why are you using this one? It's an illegitimate journalistic exercise for you to pick this single poll that is the most pro-Trump poll of all the polls you could have picked. And so I think that part of what is going on right now in the polling industrial complex and all these people that make their money off of this stuff is they're overselling. If I can leave you with this one thing, they're overselling the accuracy of polling. And they're creating an impression that the election is in a place as opposed into a range. And so that's why when I say to you, all we know today is the election is close and competitive. I think we have an advantage because we have a better candidate, better arguments, better campaign apparatus. But I also think we have all of us and the secret sauce, the secret weapon, right, that we have, this new muscle that we have, is millions of proud patriots who love their country, who get up every day and go to work to advance, to save their democracy. And, so I want to say to all of you, thank you for what you're doing. It is the most important work we can do. All of you are exhibiting the highest form of patriotism by being here tonight and love of country. You need to go win every single one of those House races in New York. By the way, I'm not going to accept anything less than that. But I told Stephen I was coming on tonight, and the deal was we had to win all the House races in New York, right? So we have no choice. You won Tom Suozzi, so what's the big deal? Now you just got a whole 4 or 5 more you got to go win. And but New York is, in a way that it usually isn't, is at the center of the entire election this time. We will probably have control of the House or not have control of the House based on what happens in the New York House races. So for the first time in a long time, you guys really could really determine the future of the country in a way that New Yorkers often don't have the opportunity to do, right? So use that understanding and go fight like hell, and let's go win, and let's have a lot to celebrate after Election Day. Thanks, everybody.
Simon, thank you so, so much. We're putting a link in the chat to give you all free access to Simon's Hopium Chronicle, and I strongly urge you to take advantage of this.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Simon. That was really great. We can elect Joe Biden if we put the work in that we need to. So we're also putting links in the chat to volunteer opportunities. And after this, we're going to email everybody these links, everyone who signed up for this Zoom link, so that we can all worry less and do more. Have a great night, everyone. Thanks so much for being on this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kathy. Great job. Thank you.